of which is retail. And Keith said that what I needed to talk to you all about is retail market analysis, since I guess that's what you're focusing on for this class. The project, I guess, will be on that. So I'm going to go through sort of the mechanics and the considerations of how you do a retail market analysis. And first of all, you ask, well, why do you do one? And it seems like an obvious question, but there's actually lots of different things retail market analysis can tell you. For one, you may have a piece of raw land or a site that is going to be something different from what it is now, and so, or maybe it is retail, but maybe it shouldn't be. Well, so you're determining just the land use for a particular site, whether you should spend the money to build a retail space or not. Well, okay, if you are going to do retail space, how much of it should you have, and what kind of space should it be? So that will tell you, the volume of space that you need, and sort of there's different physical configurations for different types of retail, and so the market analysis can help you decide on that. What tenant types should you be targeting for leasing? Because you don't want to build a retail space and then go after the wrong kind of tenant, because that's just going to leave you with a lot of time and money and frustration, time and money wasted and a lot of frustration, whereas there might be kinds of tenants that would be very happy to be in your project, and you just need to go talk to them. What kind of lease rates should you charge? What's supportable in the marketplace? Because again, you don't want to leave money on the table or set rates so high that no one wants to be in your property. And then if you're doing a larger project with a mix of uses, what kind of retail should be there that's supportable and will mix well with the other uses that are in the site. So a market analysis for retail, just as you have a market analysis for anything, has to focus on two sides, the demand and the supply, right? Because it's economics 101, demand versus supply. And so that's what you're analyzing. And we're going to start with the demand side. So if you have retail space, and it's a subtle distinction, but one that you have to keep in mind is, as a landlord or property developer, your customers are tenants or users, the people that are going to write leases or in some cases buy space in your project. So the tenants and users are your customers, but the reason that they're going to be there is because they can access their customers. They find it a good place to access their customers. So ultimately, what we care about on the demand side is there sufficient market support from the various sources of customers to attract the tenants? So how do we determine that? Well, there's four main sources or categories of sources of customers. The typically most important one is your market area residential population, and we'll talk more about what your market area is in a second. But that's just the people who are living within a certain distance of your site. Then you have the daytime or non-residential population. That means people who are working nearby or people who have to be on site on a regular basis in close proximity to your site for whatever reason, because they're going to school or because they or their families are getting treatment at a hospital nearby, or for whatever reason they have to come to that area regularly. A third category is people who are just purely passing by and would stop in because they need something, and they may not live anywhere near, they may not work anywhere near, but they're just part of the passing traffic. So we call that convenience-oriented retail customers, or just traffic, nearby traffic volume. And lastly are tourists and visitors who are in the area for leisure purposes and could be interested. They may not necessarily be that close by to your project, but they could be interested in coming to and spending money depending on the types of tenants that you have. So when you're analyzing the residential market area, the market area is going to vary by what type of retail you're talking about. Certain types of retail are very regionally oriented. If you think in terms of traditional retail, you think of a mall that has a department store. That department store, and the mall generally, for the most part, has a regional market area. Its market area is counted in the hundreds of thousands of people typically. the major metropolitan area at least, and will stretch for many miles. A community level retail center is one where your market area is going to be, not just the adjacent neighborhoods. It's going to stretch a few miles farther, but like extra large supermarkets or a Best Buy or things like that, are kind of more community level tenants. There's going to be more of them in an overall metro area than there would be regional types of stores. A third category, the smaller one, is neighborhood level. Again, these are serving people that are basically within not more than a 15-minute drive. I usually use a 10-minute drive, or walking distance or whatever. That's your neighborhood level retail, and that's oriented towards immediately adjacent residential neighborhoods or immediately adjacent daytime population. And the last category are retailers, and by the way, when I say the word retail, I'm including not just stores where you buy stuff, but businesses that are feeding you, restaurants, bars, sometimes entertainment places, fitness centers are a retail tenant type. And then there's also certain types of service businesses, where you get your hair cut or things like that aren't selling you stuff but are providing services to you. So those all fit in the category of retail. And so unique or destination type retail means that it's something that's extremely distinctive and whose market area, if anything, might be regional, but sometimes it's super regional. It's, hey, this is the place you go to get this particular type of thing because they do it best, or they're the only ones in this part of the state that carry it, or it's just an experience like no other, and that's why you go there. So you're willing to go out of your way to reach that kind of retailer. So how do we sort of define when we ultimately have to measure the market area, right? How do we define that? Well, there's different ways of doing that. You can look at, if you're a regional type of retailer, or if you're a tenant that's looking to locate, hey, we haven't been in the Houston market, we're thinking of opening, 10 stores, then you're looking at a metro level. Should we bother trying to investigate this? Then you're looking at a metro level market area, what's happening with the metropolitan area. More typically, for a particular developer or site, you're looking either at a radius or a drive time. It used to be radius was standard, where you'd say a 1, 3, 5, 10-mile type radius. How much residential population is there, and the other categories of customers that I identified. Mapping tools in the digital world have evolved so that it's much easier now to do a drive time analysis. And so, hey, neighborhood level retailer, should I locate here? I'm going to map the 10-minute drive time from my site and investigate the characteristics of that particular area. And so, at the surface level, you're just looking for things like how much population and households are there, but you're actually, normally you're doing a deeper dive into those specific demographic characteristics for residential market area. So you want to look at not just, well, what's the total population and households in this area, but what are the trends? Is it growing? Is it shrinking? Is there going to be new development that I could talk to a local government about, and they're going to know, hey, this big new master plan community is going in here, and so it's going to dramatically raise the population here in the next 5 years. You're looking at the census, of course, is the the gold standard of getting demographic information. There's also private demographic services that most people in the retail development and brokerage business subscribe to, some sort of private service that will give you, the census always lags by a year or two in terms of the kinds of population estimates and household estimates that they put out. A private service will make an estimate for the current year and usually offer a short-term projection. How accurate that short-term projection is, that's why I would recommend that you also, talk to officials or knowledgeable people in the local area that might have that information that those services wouldn't have incorporated, like a new community being built. So you're looking for those kind of trends, but then you're also looking for things like what's the buying power of that residential population, what are their typical needs based on the kinds of population that it is, and what kind of preferences or tastes, consumer tastes, do they have. So this is where you get into the more specific demographic characteristics that are pretty important for a lot of tenant types. Really knowing the demographic characteristics of the area population that's a really important thing for them to decide whether they're going to locate in a particular development. They're going to want to know what's the age profile of the nearby population. Is it dominated by families that have kids, or is it more young adults, or is there a big senior population? That's very important. Are they typically renters or owners? I mean, if you're Home Depot, right, you're going to look for a place that has a lot of owner-occupied households that are in owner-occupied housing, right? Because they're the ones that are going to be buying all that home improvement stuff. If you're renting, you're not doing as much. Household income, obviously, because that goes right to buying power. How much disposable income do you have to spend? That's also closely related to adult education levels. How far did you get? Just a high school education, or did you go all the way to a PhD? They want to know, because that not only correlates with income, it also says something about typically your taste in your preferences. Certain kinds of tenants are interested in the ethnic profile of an area, because that will also affect tastes and preferences. And then it all kind of gets wrapped up into this sort of fuzzy science called psychographics. I'll give you an example in a second, but it's sort of divvying up the population into different categories of people and households that have a sort of narrative associated with them. It's meant to say something about, again, their tastes and preferences as well as their income levels. And a lot of, I said it's a bit fuzzy science, but there are a lot of retailers that will pay attention to this. And here's just an example. I pulled this from one of our retail study reports that we did. You're getting the income profile of an area, comparing that to the greater region or Harris County in this case. How does this area compare? This particular area that I pulled the study from was kind of a very working class area, had a higher poverty rate, people of lower income, and so that's reflected here. So you can compare it to, compare it to the region overall. What is this area like? What's the share of family households? And that this particular area had been kind of losing family households and transitioning towards childless households, and so you can see, compares to a lower share of family households in the county. And on the right-hand side is this psychographics that I talked about, and I don't know how readable that is from where you're sitting, but I highlighted 5 categories here that comprise in this particular area, the largest shares of the population. It's not, for example, it's not CDS that is deciding to classify, a household data point into one of these categories. It's, again, private demographic services are doing this. It's just become very common, sort of a standard thing to do in the retail market analysis. So you can see, they're having a little narrative, American Dreams is a living example of how ethnically diverse the nation has become. Just under half the residents are Hispanic, Asian, or African American, multilingual, upper middle class comfort. I mean, according to this service, they estimate that a quarter to a third of the population in this market area falls into that category, and then they kind of divvy it out amongst the rest of the population in these other categories. So that's the residential population. When you're looking at the daytime or non-residential population, there are some sources that you can use. The one that we like to use the most is called Census, LEHD, which stands for Longitudinal Employer Household Dynamics. I think that's correct. If you just say LEHD, people will kind of know what you're talking about. And that basically, the Bureau of the Census works to estimate the number of employees within a given area. And also tries to classify them in terms of what industry they're working in, what age is the worker, a limited amount of income profile, so you get a little more information. It's not nearly as rich as the the regular census of the residential population, but at least at a minimum it gives you an estimate of the number of employees in that area. It will also tell you, as well as some other sources, will also tell you about what kinds of businesses are located in an area. Are they industrial businesses? Are they, is it office white collar worker type, or is it service businesses, etc. Now, to get other kinds of daytime or non-residential population, you have to do some legwork. So, if you're near a hospital complex, then you need to find a source that will tell you how many people are employed at that hospital, how many, what's the typical sort of patient count, how many people are visiting that hospital on a typical daily basis. So that there's not usually some, demographic service or whatever that's going to provide that for you. You have to find that out on your own. How many people are here at UH? You have to go look that up. How many students are coming here every day? And the other thing you need to be mindful of when you're getting this population, this daytime non-residential population, is what are their patterns on a typical day? Are they coming? Are they staying? They might pass through during breakfast time. Do they get much time for lunch? Are they, running errands during the middle of the day? Do they have any time after work? That kind of thing. So you need to get a sense of what are the opportunities to have them come to your property to spend money. For convenience or traffic-oriented customers, your basic thing is just to get vehicle traffic counts. Typically, it's local or state government agencies that are doing that. If you're really want to spend the money, you can get your own counts done. They'll go out and put tubes across the road and do counts. You also need to find out what you can about what are the traffic flow patterns, because you're going to be on one side of the street. Are you on the going inside in the morning, or are you on the coming home side in the evening, or is it maybe it doesn't matter? There's traffic on both ways all day. In some locations, in really high density locations, like if you were in Manhattan or something like that, then you care about what are the typical pedestrian counts passing by the front of your property. And so that's less common, but there are instances if you were at the ferry terminal, in a busy ferry, you'd want to know how many people are getting on and off the boats typically. Last category, tourist and visitor. You're assessing, what extent. It's not as big a deal here in Houston. We're not a big tourist town. But then you go down to Galveston, and it's a very big deal, because that's a lot of who's spending money in Galveston are people who are there, tourists or people on their leisure time. So trying to get some sense of the volume of visitation to a place. Do they have large convention or meeting facilities where you're bringing in big groups of people who might be on an expense account, and you can go out for dinner or want souvenirs? What kind of lodging or hotel room inventory is there, and how well occupied is it? And then are there tourism agencies like the State Tourism Agency here for Texas, or the local Convention and Visitors Bureau, that can give you data on the profile of the visitors, and might have some data on how much money they're typically spending on dining out or shopping or things like that. So that's data that you can go try to collect if it exists. And in Texas, actually, the state agency does collect data, does surveys, or they have. I haven't checked actually in the last year or two, but I used to get data on typical amounts of daily visitor spending on various categories of stuff. So those are things that you can go look up. So that kind of covers, collecting all this information on the demand side, the end customer side. And one thing I should also mention, I talked about, the non-residential population. Businesses can also be end users, so keep in mind that certain kinds of businesses may need, reprographic services or something like that, so they, or catering services. So those would be potential, retail type tenants that might locate also in your development. So that's another sort of subcategory of customer, end user customer to keep in mind. Switching over to the supply side, what you need to do is within your market area, get a good sense of the inventory of existing space, and find out whether there's going to be any changes to that inventory. Are there new retail centers that are planned, or are there some that are going to be demolished or converted to a church or something like that? You You want to know what's the total amount of square footage of inventory, and what kinds of centers are they? You know, is it a regional mall or just strip centers, what have you? What are their levels of occupancy? That tells you both, you know, how much the population or the customer base in the area is being served already. It also tells you if it's really low, it's like, there's something wrong, maybe something wrong with this retail market here that it's hard to make money in. What are the lease rates in the area? Again, that's also, you know, high lease rates indicate a high demand area where retailers have been successful. And what is the absorption patterns? I will say on absorption for retail space, it's a little less informative in some ways than it is for things like office space or apartments, where, you know, there's a direct relationship to the level of demand and absorption of the unit of measurement of the, you know, apartment unit or square footage of office space. For retail, it's a little more fungible because maybe there hasn't been a lot of absorption in your area. That doesn't mean that you can't come in and be successful, because you can provide a better product, better tenants, better location, better experience, what have you, and still be successful at attracting the kinds of customers for your tenants that they need to be successful. So just kind of take absorption with a grain of salt on retail specifically. You also want to look at not just the space that's there, but who are the occupants in that space, both the existing, and if you have information on businesses that are coming to the area, the users, retail space users coming to the area, that's important as well. To get this kind of information, there are some secondary data sources. CoStar is very well known as a service that you subscribe to. They're pretty expensive, but they're pretty reliable. There's other services similar to them. You also need to do some primary research. Go out and look for yourself. Not every bit of retail space is tracked by those third-party CoStar type services, and so you know, you need to see what's on the ground. Especially in older areas of cities where there might be just sort of random buildings that have been converted to a retail type use, and, you know, just a single building, and they may not fall into one of the CoStar type database. And local government, you know, in many places, not so much maybe in Houston area, it depends on what local government you're talking about. You know, in Sugar Land, they're going to know if a retail center is planned or not. In Houston, maybe not so much, and if you're in the county, probably not at all. So, you know, but, you know, in many places you should check with the local government as well to see what changes might be happening to the inventory. So you get a sense of what that inventory is and what's happening with it. Then you kind of look at how does it lay out in your market area. And I probably should have put a map here showing like where we've mapped, you know, here's all the existing, you know, retail centers in this particular market area. Because you want to see for the market area that that you're serving, you know, are they pretty central to that market area? Or are they sort of peripheral, where they might be drawing some from your market area, but they're probably also drawing from, you know, someplace that's away from where your site would draw. And so maybe that might leave you an opening to be able to capture more of the market area. So you look at things like that. And then the other aspect of the existing inventory that you look at is how well are retail businesses in the area performing. And in Texas, and probably in most states, you can get that data from the state, where because businesses have to pay sales tax, they have to have, you know, a sales tax permit, and they have to send their information on their gross revenues and taxable revenues to whatever agency, you know, usually the state is controlling that sales tax. And so, at least here in Texas, and probably most places, you can get down to the zip code level because they're working off the address of that particular permit holder. But you generally, unless you're getting permission from a local government, going through a local government or something like that, you can't get below that because they don't want to give away information on a specific business about the sales performance in a specific business. But at least you can get down to, you know, county or city or a zip code and find out what are the trends in retail sales and you can provide, are you familiar with NAICS codes? You all know what those are? National Association of Industrial, I can't remember, classification system, something like that. But basically all businesses have a NAICS code, and it sort of is a nested thing where, you know, 2-digit or 3-digit or multi-digit, you know, it gets more and more specific as the type of business. But on the right is a chart, you know, where we've gathered data for a specific zip code, and said, okay, for these different categories corresponding to certain NAICS codes, what have been the gross sales trends in that zip code, so you can see which businesses seem to be improving or not, and as well as some other, you know, information like I talked about, getting a sense of the inventory of the types of space and the types of businesses that are in your market area. So that's all information that you should collect. How do you competitively evaluate the supply? Because that's important to, you know, figure out, you know, hey, I can play that game too, or oh, there's no way I'm going to beat these other properties and businesses out for attracting customers. Key things that you want to evaluate are, how does your site compare to these other locations in your market area in terms of the visibility to your potential customers and how well they can access them, you know, sort of the transportation connections, how easy is it for them to get there. What are some of the qualitative factors that you may or may not have an advantage in, like the level of security? People want to feel safe when they go to a store or restaurant, whatever. You know, design and atmosphere, is it something that is particularly welcoming or warm, you know, and inviting? It's amazing how quickly retail center designs can start to feel outdated. So, you know, can you beat them with a newer, better, you know, more current type of atmosphere? And, you know, are the other centers have just physical issues with the condition of their property or the type of space that they offer? You know, retail space does obsolesce. I mean, there's been an issue over the last, you know, 10 years where lots of different kinds of big box tenants have gone away, and that space is not conducive to reuse very easily, and so it's become obsolescent. That's why you see it get converted to, you know, community colleges and libraries and things like that. And then the appeal of the existing tenants and businesses in the area. You know, are they sort of stale tenants that you know, aren't necessarily offering, you know, maybe the centers are well occupied, but they're tenants that are not necessarily addressing an audience that might be moving into the area or a younger demographic. And you have an opportunity to sort of get tenants that would, you know, separate themselves just on the basis of their own business model and the products or services that they carry. So you've collected a lot of information. Once you've done that, you can conduct a quantitative analysis that will give you a sense of, okay, based on the numbers, what are they telling me about how much room there is in this market, you know, sort of on its own for me to come in and bring some retail tenants into this space. Here, what you want to do is quantify the market area buying power in various types of store spending categories. You can get that data again from secondary, you know, subscription type data sources. We'll calculate it, or you can calculate it on your own. I just showed you that gross retail sales data from the state. What you want to do is, like, say, if you say, hey, I think this zip code over here has a really good, they seem to have a really healthy retail market. You know, it's really reflective of the kind of market I'd be serving here. I'm going to look up their statistics from the state for those spending categories and find out what the level of retail sales there are there, and divide that by, like, the number of households in that zip code. So I can get a per household spending figure, and that's sort of my benchmark. And then, you know, then multiply it by the number of households in your, you know, comparable market area, and then you have sort of a sense of buying power. Then what you do is you compare that to the actual counts of number of businesses or the spending levels, again, that you get from the state, the actuals that are happening in your area. So basically you're figuring out, is there a gap between what the theory tells me should be spent, you know, at retail businesses in my market area, or maybe, you know, they're actually pulling more sales in from outside than would be expected, in which case there's probably not room for me to come in, at least in those categories where that excess spending is. And so that's called a gap or leakage analysis. Is this area leaking sales to other areas? Meaning I could try to capture them in my development. Also, over/under analysis based on what businesses typically, the level of spending they typically need to survive. Is there a deficiency in the number of those kinds of businesses in my market area? Or are we over the count that would be expected? And so, all that has to be adjusted by, the typical, like a fast food restaurant, really needs a pretty high level of sales per square foot, whereas a secondhand clothing store, they can be profitable. They probably have to pay low rent, but they can be profitable at a much lower level of sales per square foot. And so different businesses have different sales levels that they need, and typical different store sizes as well. So you have to make adjustments for that. There used to be a publication called the Urban Land Institute Dollars and Cents of Shopping Centers that surveyed shopping centers and gave information on sales per square foot in various categories, typical store sizes, and that type of thing. Unfortunately, that's not published anymore, so you have to go get it from other sources. That's kind of hard information to get, but you need to develop a sense of what a business is going to need and what kind of typical store size would be desired for that kind of tenant. Here's an example, calculating leakage, where the gross sales. That gross sales columns means, in theory, this is what should be being spent out of the population in this area. Here's the next column, aggregate expenditures, telling you what's actually being spent. I'm sorry, reverse that. The gross sales are what's actually being spent. Aggregate expenditures meaning what we think the households or the people are spending in this market area. So when you have aggregate expenditures higher than the gross sales, then there's leakage happening, and that's that third column of numbers. If there's a surplus, that means people are coming to the area from outside to spend money. And then you can divide that to get a per household number. That's the final column in that table. And you take that number and you say, okay, here's the current leakage per household. If I'm able to, at my site, if the tenants that would be on my site could capture 20% of the main market area and another additional 10% of nearby, slightly farther away market area of this leakage, and based on how much square foot sales per square foot that kind of business would need, how much extra square feet would be supportable? What can I support on my site of that particular business category? And so that's what's calculated here. You can see how that kind of goes across the table, and you end up with different amounts of square footage that you could accommodate, or that's kind of in excess, meaning you're not going to pay much attention to those. This particular area that I took this from, it's kind of definitely a lower income area, but one thing they've got is really great Mexican restaurants, and people come in from outside the area to eat there, and that's why you see, there's actually not leakage of food services and drinking places. They have an excess, and do I really want to try to hone my way into that market where you're already pretty crowded? So as I said, you're estimating your potential market capture by store category, and that's based on that assessment of the competitive supply. How well located those other properties are, what kind of businesses they have, etc. Can I realistically capture a share of the sales that seem to be out there for me to get? And so you have to come up with a sense of what capture rate. You try to be conservative, of course, but developers are always they're an optimistic bunch. So once you've done all these quantitative calculations, say, okay, I think this area could support 2 of these kind of tenants, 1 of these, and you're starting to get a sense of what would work from the retail user's standpoint. Then you start, as a developer, you're creating sort of a leasing program where you're targeting certain types of tenants according to the analysis you've done. And you're classifying them. Is this going to be the anchor tenant for my center, meaning it's the biggest one that draws the traffic that the other tenants can use to leverage to get more business for themselves? Is it a junior anchor that's, you know, sort of that kind of idea, but just smaller, not quite as much traffic, but it's still, you know, a big deal? Is it dining? That's become an increasingly popular use as an anchor, and has different, you know, time patterns during the day. So you're developing that menu. You're programming them as to how your center is going to lay out. You know, and you know you want anchors in certain spots so that the traffic goes by the smaller tenants. You need the anchors to be visible. You want the restaurant to be visible, that kind of thing. So you have to lay that out correctly. You have to figure out how the parking works because certain businesses have different parking demand at different times. And then you have to kind of develop your range of acceptable lease rates. You know, you've got to make money, so you got to meet your pro forma, but you know, certain businesses are going to be you know, higher lease rates than others based on you know, the smaller spaces typically are paying a higher lease rate per square foot, or like a pad site might be pretty, you know, for a fast food joint might be a really high lease. You might be ground leasing it to them at a pretty high rate because you expect them to be doing a very high volume of business and making a lot of money, so they should be paying a lot of money for that lease. On the other hand, your anchor, you might be practically giving away space because, you know, nothing else will happen unless I have that anchor, and I'm basically almost indebted to them for coming to my project. And so that's not uncommon to basically practically give your site to a grocery store, for example, which is the most popular anchor there is. So, you know, sometimes the grocery stores are basically not paying rent. Some other things that affect the way you do your tenant program, the parking demand, as I said, and tenants will often have very specific demands about the parking in order for them to come execute a lease with you. You know, how do I go find businesses that are going to bring traffic at different times of day or different days of the week? You know, I don't want a center that's not going to have any business at night or be dead on the weekends. Co-tenancy requirements, this is a big deal in that the tenants that you might need most will often demand clauses in their lease contracts that say these other kinds of businesses have to be here with me, and these other kinds of businesses cannot be in this center. You know, if you execute a lease with this other kind of business, well then I'm getting out of mine and leaving your center. So there's a lot of, and these are a big deal. They're a very thorny issue for a landlord or developer. But they're just reality. And lastly, of course, usually, unless you have really deep pockets or unusual sources of capital, you're probably getting some sort of financing for this project, sort of a lender. And lenders, to lower their risk, will say, well, you know, you've got you know, a nice idea. You want to have some really great mom and pop businesses, but mom and pop businesses fail. You know, they don't often have a lot of capital to keep themselves going. It's a hard time paying rent. So your cash flow might be low, so you need to have, you know, what are called credit tenants in your project. This is typically large chains that can access, you know, they're well-funded, have existing relationships with their own lenders that can help them get through tough times or through initial startup where, you know, that 6-month period while they're still kind of ramping up their customer base and getting, you know, people learning about that they're there. And they'll require you basically to get those kind of tenants that are maybe less distinctive, but they're more established and lower the level of risk for the lender. So to kind of wrap up, you know, all these things you've got to be mindful of if you're trying to do a retail development from the market analysis perspective. There's other things that are going on that are sort of bigger trends that you have to be aware of that affect, you know, hey, maybe the analysis shows today that this is what's supportable, but this other thing, this bigger global or national trend is going on that means that 5 years down the road, you know, what's possible today really won't be, you know, isn't going to work anymore. So some of the things that affect the retail real estate world right now are the bifurcation of society, where, you know, you probably heard that the middle class has been shrinking. You know, there's been, over the last 20, 30 years, you know, a real change in the type of retail that caters to people of moderate or middle income levels. You know, you used to have Sears and Kmart and Montgomery Ward's and the five and dime stores, right? And those have been going away. I mean, I'd be surprised if Sears as a department store is here in a few years from now. It's all but dead. You know, Kmart, same thing. You know, Montgomery Ward's already failed. Five and dime stores are basically gone. So you had Walmart and Target come in, and even they are having challenges right now from dollar stores. You know, Walmart's had a tough time in the last couple of years, and they're closing stores. So there's a lot of those kinds of retailers, you know, the large ones used to form traditional anchors for shopping centers, and all of a sudden it's like, yeah, they're not there. They're not as dependable anymore. So you got to think about, is that the kind of retailer I want to anchor my project? Related to that is a shakeout in the world of indoor malls. I mean, y'all are a little younger than me, but when I was a kid, you know, malls were the height of retail development. I mean, they were considered the ultimate. They were, you know, this is what we've been working towards, you know, over 200 years of American history, right? And in the last, you know, 10 to 15 years, we've been starting to find out that, they're not quite the end game we thought they were. And so there's a big shakeout going on where only the strongest, most fortified malls that bring in a lot of upscale shoppers are the ones that really are surviving. You know, those are either dead or on life support if they're just your sort of basic middle class, you know, malls. And so, and again, that's related to a lot of the anchors that drive mall traffic, like Sears, even Macy's, you know, is having a lot of problems right now. You know, they've been failing. So, plus the inline tenants, which are traditionally, you know, those anchors, just like in a grocery center, the anchor stores at traditional malls often paid no rent. They might even own their site, and, you know, other than contributing to some of the common area maintenance costs, weren't paying a lot to the mall owner. They were there just to drive traffic and raise visibility for the mall. Well, on top of the problems that those anchors had, you had the inline tenants, that are the ones that paid the rent, started having a lot of competition from big box tenants. You know, bookstores went away because Borders and Barnes & Noble appeared. So the mall bookstores died. And Barnes & Noble and Borders were usually not mall tenants. They were in big box centers. Also, e-commerce, you know, has taken a big chunk in the last 10 years from those kind of tenants as well. So, and e-commerce and omni-channel, which is retail businesses having both a brick and mortar and an online presence. They're still trying to figure out how that all works. So there's a lot of uncertainty going on around the impact. You know, it's grown, as the graphic here shows. You know, this holiday season was considered unspectacular overall for retail. I mean, you know, sales went up, but not as much as people hoped. But the vast majority of that increase came from online buying as opposed to brick and mortar sales. So, you know, this is something that just keeps growing, and no one's really sure, you know, what's the ultimate impact on brick and mortar retail. A couple other things that are going on: the evolution of consumer habits. We're eating out a lot more than we were when I was a kid, and that means more restaurants with more traffic. And what's been happening is that for a lot of retail centers, dining has become the new anchor. You know, the first thing they're looking at is not some, you know, famous clothing store. They're looking for, what restaurant am I going to get to be the anchor tenant for my project? That's something that was not the case 20, 30 years ago. So that's a new thing that's happened. The renewed growth of urban living, and so now you have people with disposable income have been moving in, you know, significant amounts back into the center of cities where retail had abandoned before, and now you have all these people that, you know, can spend money on stuff, but you don't have, you know, once the retail world had settled into sort of the big box and indoor mall configuration, they didn't really know how to go back and do retail like it was 50, 60 years ago. And so now they're trying to figure out how to reconfigure themselves to go back and capture some of that spending that people who, you know, all these people with money that have moved back into cities. Because you don't have the kinds of sites typically in most cities. In Houston, you can still find sites where you can do a big box center and things like that. But in a lot of cities you can't. And so having to adjust their models to be able to handle that. New formats that weren't seen before. The urban shopping model has been transplanted to suburban locations in the form of lifestyle and town centers. And those things did not exist before like the mid-90s. And now we have some very successful ones here, and some retail chains, that's primarily where they're located almost. That's the kind of environment that they want. And so they've been shown to generate a lot of sales per square foot, get people to stay a long time, which means the longer they're staying, the more likely they are to spend more money while they're there. So this is a format that we do expect to see more of. And then outlets. They've been, the outlet model has been around a long time, but in the last 10 to 15 years, it's really gotten refined. And big name retailers now have their outlet version. You have, Off Fifth, you have Nordstrom Rack, Macy's is coming out with their outlet model. They develop, specific clothing or other product lines that go direct to outlet, basically, and never even appear in the main full price store. And the actual type of outlet centers have been changing to almost that sort of outdoor mall type format. If you've been to the one in Cypress, the premium outlets, or the one in Texas City, which is the same developer basically, now they've really come up with much more sophisticated physical formats for outlets. And so it's interesting to see, how those are evolving and how much of retail spending they are capturing that might have otherwise gone to more regular full price retailers. Everyone talks about millennials, and they are a big demographic bulge. So, I guess y'all probably fit in the millennial category, most of you. And the things that you like to do and shop for and eat and spend time, maybe a little bit different from the way I did. And so retailers are trying to figure out how do we, they're also shopping online a whole bunch, and so it's like, well, how do we get people to actually come in, these millennials to come in our stores? And there's a lot of analysis going on about, okay, what do millennials want out of their shopping experience? And, this idea of authenticity keeps coming up. They're not looking for the canned, package chain, retail type experience. They like things that are artisanal or, craft made, craft beer, which I support wholeheartedly, and other types of goods that, have a lot of personal touch to them. Experiential retail, where it's not just about the thing you're buying, but the way that you're buying it, the way you're interacting with the vendor. All those things seem to be things that are very important to millennials, at least millennials that have disposable income or in the upper middle class. And then that gets to this idea of independent businesses or unique type businesses versus chain or formula businesses. And as I talked about earlier, those chains, those big national chains that millennials are kind of more wishy-washy about are the ones that are the credit tenants. So if you want to attract, I want to create the coolest shopping experience ever for millennials, I'm going to have, totally unique independent tenants that offer experiences that you can't get anywhere else, and all those 30-year-olds that have great jobs, they're going to come and hang out at my place. Well, if I'm your lender, I'm like, well, that's all well and good, but how those startup businesses you're trying to have, that they might fail, and I want you to have a national chain in your center. So they haven't been able to figure out how to adapt, their development models. The large developers have. What you're seeing are sort of smaller retail developers, usually, who are able to kind of fix up the old spaces or develop new ones that can get these kinds of tenants, to create that sort of atmosphere that I'm talking about here. There are some larger scale developers that are starting to, figure out ways to adapt. But again, with new retail space, if you're building new, that space is going to probably be more expensive. You have to lease it out at a higher rate so that you can make your pro forma than if you had an older building where, unless you have to invest a whole bunch in sort of making it habitable, you know, you can probably offer it at a lower lease rate. That means that independent tenant is going to find it easier to go in there and grow their business. So there's a lot of challenges for trying to hit this kind of tenant category that, you know, seems to be the zeitgeist of millennial retail right now. So that kind of concludes sort of our overview of retail market analysis, and I'm happy to entertain questions and find out a little bit about your project, I guess. You know, is any of what I said really applicable? I guess that would be important. Yeah.
Okay, so I was looking at the gap leakage analysis, and if I understood correctly, you kind of got through those numbers, at least going to maybe the state controller website or something, form like that, to get your average spend per category based on the NAICS code, right?
Right.
Now, how do you get the actuals?
Well, it's not you are calculating the average from the actuals. For example, you're saying, oh, you know, Sugar Land, they're a city that, you know, has really healthy retail market, and I think their household and population profile is very similar to my market area or what my market area is going to be. Therefore, I'm going to go get the actual, go to the state controller, get the actual retail sales for the categories of retail that are in Sugar Land, you know, and get a calculate find out how many households are in Sugar Land, get a per household number, and that's what I think my market area is going to be able to support. So that's sort of a way, instead of getting it from a third-party sort of subscription demographic service that says, okay, here's your, you know, expected expenditures per store type or spending category. You know, it's a way of sort of doing it yourself. You have to pick the right comparable market, because, you know, it's like, you know, if it's a market that maybe you have a similar population profile to your market area, but also, for whatever reason, gets a whole bunch of outside visitor spending. You know, that's going to skew their number and make them sort of not comparable. So you really have to look at all those things to make sure that spending profile would seem to be what your market area would be most like. Yes?
Have you looked at a lot of geographical traits, such as climate or density of a city, that dictate the type of shopping experiences that would be more pertinent to those areas?
Not so much climate. I mean, obviously, in places like Houston or places that are, you know, extreme cold, you know, Minneapolis or something, where, you know, parts of the year, you know, where being in an air-conditioned space is very nice, or heated space is very nice. And so, you know, that does seem to, there's probably some impact there, but it's interesting that these models that I talked about, you know, that would seem to be climate dependent, have been working everywhere, no matter what the climate. And it's interesting that that's happening. I mean, I think you're going to still have to be sensitive. You know, an outdoor center in Phoenix has misters, right? Now, as far as the density of the city, you know, that really gets baked into the quantitative analysis. Now, it's also going to impact the physical configuration, because if it's really dense, that probably means you don't have a site where you can do a big box thing with a giant parking lot, right? Right, where they introduced sort of a model that we didn't have here, right? You know, sort of very dense type thing. And what they were trying to create, in addition to having, you know, the office, what they did is two things. They, well, three things. They took advantage of a fairly affluent, you know, that West Side market is fairly affluent, so there's a lot of spending power in the general area. But even more than that, they put a lot of daytime or non-residential population on that site because of the office buildings and because well, mainly the office buildings. They also have like a fitness center, which is sort of a retail tenant, but also means that there's a lot of people coming to work out, right? So you have that captive audience. They put residential on the site, so they further, you know, typical in those mixed-use centers, you know, putting apartments on the site is usually not going to be enough to support a retail tenant on its own. Maybe a really tiny business that, you know, convenience store or something like that. But it sort of just adds, you know, some extra spending and puts bodies around to make it seem alive, you know, at, during more hours of the week. And the third thing the City Center did was, create an experience that didn't exist, right? As you go there, it's like, oh, this is really different, it's really fun. And I want to come back because I enjoy just the feeling of being here. Obviously, they got quality tenants as well, you know. But, you know, you go to many places around the world that have sort of a similar feeling, and, you know, the tenants may not be that special. You know, it's an average ice cream shop or something, it's nothing special, but you still go there because you like being there. So they did those three things really well.
No, the reason why I asked is because I'm from New Jersey and New York City kind of area, and the type of retail that I see here in terms of these, you know, outlets or the city centers, you don't have that much space to be able to do those types of setups, particularly when you go to the suburbs to get that experience. And then climate-wise, I lived in Ohio, and they had an outdoor mall like that, like you would see in, like Carolyn and some of those other places. And one thing about it is in the wintertime, I never wanted to go there. And a lot of people didn't because it was just too cold to be walking around there to me. And a lot of the individuals that I would associate with. But it works perfectly here because most times it's not too cold. And if it's really hot, you can kind of deal with that. But I just wonder if that helps kind of impact the type of real estate.
Yeah, I think, you know, it's more like you handle it through the design.
Gotcha.
And, you know, here, you know, I mentioned there's plenty of shade, right?
Right.
You know, up there, you know, it's make sure that there's a lot of wind protection, you know, so that when it's colder, you know, you're not getting blown by a below freezing wind, and, you know, you're cleaning off the snow when there's snow and ice. And that center, if it's Columbus, the one in Columbus, if that's the one you're thinking of, I mean, it's been really successful, even if it doesn't have much winter. Maybe there's not that much winter business, I don't know. You know, but I think you have to handle those issues a lot through design. And, you know, there's some kinds of tenants that are not going to locate in a center like that. They have their physical model, and they're going to, you know, that kind of setup is not going to work for them, or they don't think it's going to work for them.
Right.
You know, for example, a convenience-oriented retail, you know, for the most part, it's depending on the ability of people, or depending on automobile traffic and the ability of people to zip right up to the front door, run in and get something, and leave. You know, is not going to be a typical candidate for one of those things where, you know, you're parking around the corner in a parking lot or a garage or something, and you walk, you know, and you might stop for, you know, get your ice cream or something in the way, also on your way to get the other thing. You know, that would not be a good match. You know, Walmart, not a good match, right? Something like that. So, yeah, there's roles for both kinds. Right now in Houston, it's getting, like, you know, I've heard retail developers complaining because there's a lot of densification going on in the middle of the city, and so there's fewer sites to do the kind of typical big strip center that they're used to doing, and the ones that are there, it's like they find it too expensive to make the numbers work, and the land cost is too much, and they're like, how are we going to do retail? You know, well, you know, they managed to make it work in Chicago and New Jersey and New York and places like that, you know. Figure it out.
That picture on the right is City Creek Mall in Salt Lake City. It was the only mall completed in 2013.
In the United States.
In the United States. Had some very, very big backers, and it's an open air for most of it, but they have tops that close, huge glass tops that close during the winter, because as you can imagine in Utah it gets pretty cold. That was a very expensive project. I think it was a $1 per square foot figure that it was just astronomical, but they had some big backers on that.
That's another thing about, you know, those kind of centers have, you know, they have a lot of landscaping, they have funky shades, ice shades or whatever to keep the weather out. So that's operating costs. That's going to be more than your typical big box strip center. I don't know that it's as much as an indoor mall though. Indoor malls have very high operating costs because they're heating, cooling, cleaning, maintaining, you know, a big indoor space, and that takes a lot of money. So, you had a question?
So lifestyle centers seem to indicate came around in the mid-90s or something like this, and you know we get these malls that are, you know, closed up as well. We got Millennials now with experiential jazz and with restaurants in this field. I'm wondering, is this a fad? And can
retail needs rooftops, but what's under the roofs really matter, depending on your retail tenant. Then, I'm just thinking like, I read an article about lifestyle that said if you have a lifestyle place, but all of the tenants are like, oh, Coldwater Creek and all those places that
Which is
appeal-
gone now, by the way.
Yeah, exactly, but appeal to like an older generation, then your young person is not going to want to go there.
Right.
Even if it offers a cool experience, the tenant's not relevant.
Right.
So I guess I'm just wondering, like,
Or like what happened,
what are your
or what
thoughts
happened
on
in,
lifestyle?
I'll tell you, in the early 90s, it was like big box explosion. That was a new format.
Okay.
You know, not that Walmart and Target didn't exist before, but all those other categories, you know, the big bookstores and the giant shoe stores and electronic stores, those really didn't exist.
Right.
And so the idea of a power center, a big box power center, was a brand new thing in the early 90s, and people thought, this is it. And, you know, they started popping up everywhere. And there's still some being built, but way, way, way less than there used to be. And a lot of the tenants that went into those stores, you know, have disappeared. Like in the span of, you know, half my lifetime, an entire format sort of reached its apex and is now kind of, not that it's gone, but it's, you know, just a relatively smaller part of the landscape, because online, for one, you know, has come in, and people, you know, I'm not going to go to the big box store and find a park and blah blah blah. I'm just going to, you know, hit the internet. I mean, you know, Barnes and Noble, are they, you know, they're trying to hang all borders already went away. You know, they're just the most famous example of those kind of things. So you got to be in retail. Retail to me is like the hardest land use to develop, really, because the demographics change, the preferences change, the business models change, the technology changes. I mean, you got to be on your game all the time, and yet, you know, you're locking yourselves into these multi-year leases, and you're just hoping, it's like, okay, I'm getting this tenant, seems to be really hot. I hope this tenant, you know, 5 years and 7 years from now may not be anymore, and that's not your fault. It's just things change, you know.
So you think lifestyle centers are going to be around for a while? I mean, that's kind of the hot thing right now.
I think,
or
you know, it's an idea that will probably keep evolving.
Okay.
You know, I mean, initially a lot of them were being developed with like people saying this is just a mall with a roof off, right? It's just the same idea, but you know, there's no roof, it's all retail, and there's a big parking lot around it. And then they started changing, you know, where you started adding more office space for retail or other things. You started getting the city center type of thing. You know, that was a sort of an evolution, you know, if you will, a very large scale evolution of the town, of that kind of lifestyle center. But you know, they're going to keep evolving, and the ones that, you know, first came out in the 90s or whatever will have to adapt too, or die. So, or they turn into, you know, they downscale or something like that and become, they stay as they are, but they trade out tenants for something that serves a different demographic. And that's the role of retail.
Well, maybe what we do, more questions, but you'd asked kind of what we're doing, right? And
Right.
actually, hope everybody is paying very close attention to we sort of set up probably about 2/3 of what we're doing.
You can pay me later.
So effectively, at the end of the day, what we're going to have is a sort of historic look. We're looking at the data
finally a retail guru for Houston.
Yeah, no, that was also really good. And so it was good because he is kind of out there some on sort of like that cutting edge of what's going on. So kind of giving a bit of a glimpse into things. One of the things you brought the big box before, kind of what's happening in that. You mentioned these like combo lifestyle center big box. So it's like a big box center built like a lifestyle center. And actually we haven't had. I don't think any of us have actually looked that up yet, but it's like that's like almost kind of cutting edge. I don't think we've even seen it in Houston yet.
Right.
If someone had done it, it would probably be on the list of candidate projects.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it was a big deal, like when Target went into Memorial City. People were like, what? what is this? This has not been done.
Yeah.
And it seems to work for them. So, yeah, I mean, it's also look at ones that haven't turned out as planned. Why didn't, well, it's now called Green Street. It was called Pavilions when it opened. Well, why didn't that work?
Right.
Which I can give you my reasons, but you just ask yourself what went wrong there. There's a lot of malls around Houston that are, like I said, on life support, or you would never consider going there anymore. What's going on with those places? Why are they doing what they're doing? You can go up on 1960 and see empty retail centers, and they're just dead. Like, gosh, what happened? Why is it apocalyptic here? What changed? So, or what was wrong with these centers that being built to begin with? So there's a lot of things you can look at as to why things didn't work out that contribute to stuff too.
Maybe one question? Anybody have one?
Well, I'm kind of curious to hear why you think that the pavilions failed.
Well, there's two main reasons, I think. One and the biggest reason is that soft goods retail, which is what they were trying to do primarily. Yeah, they have some dining places which have, hung on. Those have done okay. But soft goods retail, which is clothing, shoes, not like furniture is not. Furniture is sort of, it's a discretionary good, but it doesn't usually. It's things you can just walk out of the store with in your hands. It's stuff. And downtown has a great daytime population, but limited time to shop. So, Macy's was there for a long, Foley's was there for many decades. It did okay, but those people go home at 5, 6 o'clock. There was no residential population there in downtown, or for many years, not even close to downtown, really.
Yeah.
The only residential populations near downtown were poor. So, you didn't have a population base with disposable income to support that kind of retail. And, if you're thinking about any kind of large-scale soft goods retailer, like the kind that would go in sort of a mall, which is kind of the kinds of tenants that they were trying to bring in, you draw that radius, right? And those kind of tenants have a big radius or a big drive time area. What does that look like? If you point the center of that is the pavilion site. Well, you've got sort of, it's a 20-minute drive or something. You've got one half of that is generally pretty affluent, has a lot of disposable income, and then you have half that, until very recently, did not have that, right? Was poor, mostly poor, very working class, and wasn't going to do much to support those kind of stores. If you're one of those stores, are you going to locate in a place that sort of, has half and half of what you want and half of what you don't want? Or are you going to locate in a place that all the way around you has what you want? So in a sense, that kind of strategy was doomed from the start. I think they overestimated the impact that the daytime office population could have. It's not that it doesn't have an impact, but it's not enough. And the other thing is the design of the project was really not very appealing. you know, because it's like, to really see what's here, I kinda have to like wander in this little alley, and I'm not really sure what, you know, that feels weird. Why would I go in there? Instead of having things face the streets. We have small blocks here, so it's not like you needed to create a new street necessarily. So, I think the design was also problematic, and, you know, the current owners of it, who are very savvy local developers, are trying to do a lot more to sort of, make that interior space more inviting, but also make the outside of it much more visible and inviting, so people, you know, will be attracted to it, you know, face more things to the outside. So, they still got their work cut out for them, you know, having the hotel will help, but, you know, it's still a tough project, so I wish them luck.
Do you think that all the new residential projects in downtown will also help that?
They will definitely help. I mean, those are expensive rental units, so those are people, unless they're spending all of their disposable income on rent, then they'll have money to spend, so that will help. You know, I haven't calculated lately how many thousands of residents are going to end up being there, but it's enough. It's not enough for a larger clothing store, but it's certainly enough to have some neighborhood, you know, a little bit of neighborhood level type stuff. Not so much what that project is about, but it's enough so that at least people will be around. That's the other thing. You like to go in a mall or a shopping center if you're like my only customer there, especially if you're a woman. What's that like? No. And you know, having more people around will also help. Just people on the streets because they live there. So the residential development will help, possibly substantially. I'm still not sure it'll be enough. But we're also getting a lot more, the hotel development on site and the other hotels that are coming in, so you're going to have a lot more of the visitor component, you know, as well, that could venture over there. And so between all those things, hopefully it'll be enough to sort of give it new life.
Okay, well, thank you, Steve.
You're welcome.